So moving on to control. So this shows the difference and the change in implicit attitudes versus explicit attitudes. All right, remember, implicit, just learned, conditioned, we're unaware, they're automatic. And you can see that they've remained pretty much the same throughout, our childhood and adulthood after 6. And then explicit beliefs, especially explicit racial beliefs, tend to decrease as we get older. And so is this a function of we really stop believing these things, or is it a function of we now understand that there are social implications and it's not okay to say that stuff out loud? I don't know, but there's some biological evidence that maybe we just don't believe this anymore as we get older, which is good, right? It's a good thing, good news. So the area of the brain that's really involved in this part is the anterior cingulate cortex. And so that the anterior cingulate cortex kind of just detects a conflict in social cues and in bias detection. And so it also helps us control our behavior, because remember that amygdala sends those signals, it triggers these different facial movements and behavioral responses. But then, if given some time, that anterior cingulate cortex can detect that conflict, like, wait a minute, this isn't a threat. We don't need to act like this. We need to calm down. And it can initiate some relaxation. Same thing that happens with if someone comes up behind you and I don't know, scares you or whatever, it's going to initiate that fear and behavioral startle response. And then you're going to look and you're going to see and you're going to process and you're going to calm down. And that's, partly how we can think of this anterior cingulate cortex, or this self-regulation of implicit bias and prejudice. So what we see, remember I shared with you about the research that white subjects were put in an MRI, and when they were shown subliminal images of Black faces, their amygdala lit up. Didn't even process it super fast. Well, if you give them more time so they can process it, then it gives time for this anterior cingulate cortex to kick in. And that's what we see with people who have high levels of prejudice, like implicit bias, unconscious, automatic, but low levels of explicit bias. Then you see this amygdala activation, and then this anterior cingulate cortex activation, and then an inhibition of the amygdala. So we can regulate this response, and we do regulate this response. It's not regulated if it's so fast, so quickly that it's a subconscious image, and that's 30 milliseconds. Now, there are certain situations where actually our ability to control all of this and to inhibit this is actually impaired. And this really has implications on our society and media and what we watch and advertisement. Because if white study subjects were listening to violent misogynistic rap music, which is associated, right, with the stereotype, with the social category of Black class, their amygdala lit up. And so here is no music, and then violent rap music, and then you can see the death metal did not make the amygdala light up even more. But then there were other areas of the brain in the frontal lobe that lit up with the rap music that didn't light up with the other two. And it wasn't the anterior cingulate cortex to decrease some of the amygdala response. It was actually other areas about that involved rationalizing things. And so what the researchers found, or what the hypothesis was, is that because they were primed with this stereotype, it overwhelmed their ability to counter their own implicit bias. And that frontal lobe activity that they saw was actually the result of justifying their prejudice and justifying how they were feeling, right? Because if we're feeling uncomfortable, we need to sometimes excuse it rather than get to the root of that. And that's what tends to happen. And so, you know, we have to think about, you know, the exposures that people are encounter every day. And we can change some of this with changing our understanding of like intergroup dynamics. And so with in-group members, remember, we are quicker, we have a quicker reaction time to be able to discern happy faces, right? And so like a bias occurs whenever there is a slower reaction time. And so let's look at this study control chart. And I'll explain it. It takes a minute for me to get adjusted, but okay. So study one control. If I am primed with a negative word and I see a bunch of negative words, right? That conflicts with seeing a happy face, and it takes me just a little bit longer to process that. And you guys have probably seen the little the test where it shows the word blue, but it's black, and you have to, you know, click on the black color or something. And it takes a little bit longer when those things don't match up, right? And so this is the same concept. And so when you're given a positive target word, that is congruent, actually, those two fit together, and your reaction time is a lot quicker. And so you can process the happy face. And then it's the opposite with sad face, right? Because that's the opposite. So that's the control. Now, when people were told to look at in-group faces versus out-group faces, and the groups were, you know, a fictional sports team. And they were told that the out-group was their rival, they were in competition, they wanted them to lose. That automatically changed the bias towards the out-group faces, and there was some implicit bias in that. So for the in-group, this is consistent kind of with the control, right? Because our feelings are more consistent with the in-group. Now for the out-group, who we actually don't like, who we're in competition with, you see the opposite effect. A positive target word or a negative target word, actually, we had a quicker reaction, and we could process their happy faces, because like we feel mad when the out group, our competition, gets something that we don't, right? And this is similar to what you saw in that baby clip, right? In the module, and it's similar to what you saw with the monkey clip, right? Our amygdala is triggered when the out group is getting something. And so you see the negative target word being more associated with happy faces. And then the opposite, when they're sad, we're kind of cheerful. We kind of get this little joyful feeling whenever they are getting punished or whatever. And that's just kind of biological. So what happens now in a new experiment where we're still different teams, but now the people are told that the in-group actually benefits from the out-group success. And so, and this is pretty profound, right? Because when our liberation is tied together, the motivation changes, and so does our biology and our bias. And what you see is actually, we're not as in sync with the in-group anymore. And then you see the opposite, you know, more congruent feelings with the out-group, because they're our allies. And, you know, our success depends on theirs, and we're in this together. And so just changing the whole intergroup dynamic and motivation can change and impact our amount of prejudice. So we have all of these things that impact our conditioning and learning of stereotypes and prejudice. But then once these become, these are automatic and often subconscious, but we can initiate suppression factors and help suppress some of this, or we could justify it. And when you have an imbalance between these and you end up justifying it, that's when it results in discrimination and conflict. And so this is how it works.